What destroys a man faster than betrayal is the moment he realizes it was planned while he was still calling it love. I still remember the exact tone in her voice when she said it, calm, almost detached, like she was discussing the weather instead of ending the version of our life I thought we were still building. My name is Daniel Carter, 38 years old, financial operations analyst in Chicago, Illinois, used to structured systems, predictable outcomes, and logic that usually made sense until that night. It started in our kitchen, the same place where we had shared thousands of ordinary conversations about groceries, bills, and weekend plans that never felt important enough to remember at the time. Sarah Carter stood across from me near the counter, her hands resting on the marble surface like she needed physical contact with stability before she said something that would remove it. I noticed immediately that something was off, not because she was loud or emotional, but because she was too controlled, too deliberate, like every word had already been chosen long before I walked into the room. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking, and I remember thinking it was strange how silence can sometimes feel heavier than explanation. Then she said it without raising her voice, without hesitation, without the kind of emotional buildup that usually comes with difficult conversations. She told me she had been sleeping with my best friend, Michael Reed, as if she was stating a fact that no longer required permission to exist. For a moment, I did not respond. Not because I did not hear her, but because my mind was trying to determine if I had misunderstood the language of the sentence itself. Michael Reed was not just a name in my life. He was someone I had known since college, someone I had trusted without question, someone who had been present in nearly every major milestone of my adult life. I looked at Sarah again, expecting something to change in her expression, expecting irony, hesitation, anything that might suggest this was not fully realized. There was nothing. She continued to look at me with the same calm certainty, and that was when I understood she was not confessing to seek forgiveness, but to establish control over the conversation that was about to follow. The kitchen felt different after her words, not physically, but structurally, like the space had shifted into something I no longer recognized. I remember hearing the refrigerator hum louder than usual, noticing the way the clock on the wall seemed suddenly irrelevant, as if time itself had lost alignment with what had just been said. Then she added another sentence, softer but sharper in meaning, telling me that if I could not handle it, maybe we should divorce. That was the moment the conversation stopped being about confession and became something else entirely, something closer to an evaluation of my reaction. I still did not speak. Instead, I studied her face, not in anger, but in a way that felt almost detached, as if I was observing someone I had once known but no longer fully recognized. There was no visible regret in her expression, no emotional conflict, only certainty that she had already moved beyond the version of our marriage I was still standing inside. Somewhere in the background of my thoughts, I became aware that this was not an impulsive moment, not a single decision made in isolation, but something that had likely been unfolding over time without my awareness. The realization did not come with emotion at first, only clarity, the kind that forms when denial is no longer supported by evidence. Sarah finally broke eye contact, glancing briefly toward the hallway, as if the conversation itself no longer required her full attention. I remained still, understanding that whatever came next would not be about saving what we had, but about understanding exactly how long I had been standing in a reality she had already exited. For a few seconds after she said it, the kitchen did not feel like part of my home anymore, but more like a place where something irreversible had just been documented in real time. I remember that I still had one hand resting near the counter, not moving, not reacting, as if movement itself would confirm that what I had just heard was real. Sarah Carter stood across from me in the same position, her posture unchanged, her expression still calm in a way that now felt more intentional than natural. There was no visible urgency in her face, no regret, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that made the situation feel less like an emotional breakdown and more like a finalized decision she had already accepted long before speaking. I eventually shifted my weight slightly, not because I was ready to respond, but because remaining completely still had begun to feel like surrendering control of the moment. When I finally spoke, my voice came out lower than expected, not because of anger, but because I was still organizing my thoughts into something that made structural sense. I asked her how long it had been happening. It was not a question meant to accuse or provoke, but a way to establish timeline, because timelines were the only thing I could still rely on in that moment. She hesitated for the first time, just barely, then told me it was not a single point in time, but something that developed gradually, beginning months earlier during periods I had assumed were normal distance in a marriage under routine stress. The name Michael Reed entered the conversation again without emotional emphasis, but hearing it a second time created a different kind of realization, not shock, but alignment of fragmented details I had not previously connected. I started recalling small inconsistencies, delayed responses, moments where conversations had ended too quickly, and the way certain plans had been adjusted without clear explanation. At the time, none of those details had felt significant enough to challenge trust, but now they began to reorganize themselves into something coherent. Sarah moved slightly toward the sink, not as an attempt to leave the conversation, but as if proximity to routine objects made the situation easier to manage. She rested one hand lightly on the edge, then continued speaking in the same controlled tone, explaining that she had not intended for me to find out the way I did, but also making it clear that she no longer saw the situation as something that required concealment. There was a distinction in her language that I noticed immediately, the difference between regret and resignation, and she was not expressing regret. She added that she believed honesty now was better than continuing a version of our life that had already changed without my awareness. That sentence stayed in the air longer than the others, not because it was louder, but because it reframed everything that had come before it as something already concluded. I remember looking toward the hallway briefly, not because I intended to leave, but because I needed a reference point that was not her voice. The house itself felt unchanged, but my perception of it was no longer anchored in familiarity. The kitchen lights were still on, the refrigerator still humming, the same quiet sounds of an ordinary evening still present, yet none of it matched the internal shift that had taken place within the conversation. I asked her if Michael Reed had ever intended to tell me, and she answered without certainty, saying she did not know what he planned or what he believed. That uncertainty was the first thing in her speech that felt emotionally neutral rather than controlled. After that, she became quieter, as if the main structure of what she needed to say had already been delivered. I remained standing where I was, not because I had reached acceptance, but because I was still separating emotion from information, trying to understand what part of my life was now being reinterpreted in real time. At that point, I realized that the conversation was no longer about discovery, but about recalibration, and everything that followed would depend not on what had happened, but on how I chose to interpret what was still unfolding in front of me. The silence that followed her explanation did not feel empty. It felt structured, as if the conversation had entered a phase where words were no longer needed for information, only for confirmation of what had already been understood. I remained standing in the kitchen, still positioned near the counter, my attention no longer focused on her as a person alone, but on the sequence of facts she had placed into the space between us. Sarah Carter had shifted slightly away from the sink now, no longer leaning on it, instead, standing with her arms relaxed at her sides in a way that suggested she had already moved past the emotional peak of the conversation. That realization created a strange contrast, because I was still inside the moment while she appeared to be observing it from a completed distance. I asked her why she chose that moment to tell me, and she responded with a calmness that did not match the weight of the question, saying that waiting longer would have only extended what she now considered a necessary conclusion. There was no anger in her tone, only a kind of procedural clarity that made the entire situation feel less like betrayal and more like administrative finality. I remember noticing how the kitchen light reflected differently on the countertop, small details becoming unusually sharp as my mind began focusing on anything that was not emotional interpretation. Sarah continued speaking, adding that Michael Reed had not been hidden in the way I might assume, but rather that the changes in her behavior had been visible if I had been paying attention differently. That statement did not feel like justification, but it also did not feel like apology. It existed somewhere outside both categories, which made it harder to respond to. I eventually moved away from the counter for the first time, taking a slow step toward the center of the kitchen, not to approach her, but to break the fixed position I had been holding since the conversation began. She followed the movement with her eyes, but did not adjust her stance. I asked her what she expected from me now, and there was a brief pause before she answered that she did not expect a specific reaction, only acknowledgement that she was being honest about a situation that could no longer be maintained in its previous form. The wording of that sentence stayed with me because it framed the relationship not as something ending in conflict, but as something already structurally altered beyond repair. I remember thinking about Michael Reed again, not as a name attached to emotion, but as a point of connection between two parts of my life that had previously been separate. The idea that both trust and familiarity could shift without clear visibility made the room feel less like a home and more like a place where information had been quietly reorganized without my participation. Sarah looked at me again, and for the first time, there was something closer to fatigue in her expression, not regret, but the absence of further explanation she felt necessary to provide. She said she did not want the conversation to turn into conflict, and that what she had already said represented everything she needed to communicate. That sentence marked another transition in the moment, because it indicated that she considered the exchange functionally complete. I stood there processing not only what had been revealed, but the realization that she had already moved beyond the emotional framework I was still trying to understand. The house outside the kitchen remained quiet, unchanged in its physical structure, yet completely different in meaning. I could hear a distant clock ticking from another room, and the sound felt unusually precise, as if time itself had become more noticeable only because something within it had been disrupted. I asked her if she had considered the impact on everything we had built together, and she responded that she had considered it, but that her perspective on what we had built no longer aligned with continuing it in the same form. That answer did not escalate the situation, but instead finalized its direction. At that moment, I realized that the conversation was no longer about discovery or explanation, but about the point at which two interpretations of the same life could no longer coexist in the same structure. The conversation had reached a point where silence no longer felt like absence, but like structure, as if every unspoken second was now carrying its own meaning inside the space between us. I remained in the kitchen, no longer anchored to the counter, standing instead in a position that gave me a full view of Sarah Carter without feeling like I was reacting to her presence. She was still calm, still composed, but the distance in her expression had become more noticeable, not physical distance, but emotional separation that had already completed itself long before the conversation began. I asked her if she had spoken to Michael Reed recently, and she answered without hesitation that there had been no reason to continue hiding communication that was already part of the situation. That response confirmed something I had already begun to understand, which was that the boundaries I had assumed existed were not the same boundaries she had been operating within. There was no visible urgency in her voice, no attempt to soften the impact of what she was saying, only a consistent tone of finality that suggested she had already moved beyond the stage of emotional negotiation. I remember noticing how the kitchen suddenly felt quieter, not because anything had changed in sound, but because my attention had shifted into a different kind of awareness where even small details became unusually defined. The light above the stove cast a steady glow across the surfaces, and I found myself focusing on those details as a way to maintain clarity while processing what was being said. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, turning just enough to face me more directly, and she said that she did not want the conversation to become repetitive, because in her view, everything essential had already been communicated. That statement created another layer of realization, because it indicated that from her perspective, the conversation was not unfolding, it was concluding. I asked her if she understood what this meant for the long-term structure of our lives, and she responded that she had already considered that outcome and accepted it as part of the decision she had made. There was no hesitation in her words, no attempt to revisit earlier assumptions, only a steady alignment with a conclusion that appeared to have been reached independently of the present moment. I found myself pausing again, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was adjusting to the realization that I was still treating the situation as something unresolved while she was treating it as something already complete. The difference between those two states became more significant than anything else being said. I took a slow breath and asked her if she believed reconciliation was still possible, and she looked at me for a longer moment than before, then said that she did not see a path where returning to the previous version of the relationship would make sense for either of us. That answer did not carry emotion, but it carried structure, as if she was describing a system that had already reached its final configuration. I remember glancing briefly toward the hallway again, not because I intended to leave, but because I needed a point of reference outside of the conversation itself. The house remained unchanged, but its meaning within my perception had already shifted significantly. Sarah remained still after speaking, no longer adding new information, no longer expanding on her position, as if she had completed everything she intended to say. I stood there processing not only the content of her words, but the realization that the conversation itself had entered a phase where continuation was no longer necessary for her, only for me. That imbalance became the central point of awareness in the room, and everything else began to align around it, including silence, distance, and the recognition that what I was still trying to understand had already been decided elsewhere. The moment she finished speaking, the kitchen did not return to normal, because there was no normal state left to return to. Only a continued awareness that everything I had previously understood was now being viewed through a different framework. I remained standing in the same space, no longer focused on maintaining position or control of the conversation, but instead trying to understand the full structure of what had just been established between us. Sarah Carter was still there, still calm, still composed, but the emotional distance between us had become more defined than anything physical in the room. It was not that she was far away, but that she was no longer operating within the same interpretive space as I was. I asked her if she had already decided what would happen next in practical terms, meaning whether she intended to move forward immediately with separation or if there was still room for delay or reconsideration. She responded without hesitation that she had already begun making adjustments in her personal planning, not in a way that required immediate disruption, but in a way that no longer assumed continuation of the current structure. That statement confirmed what had been forming in my mind since the beginning of the conversation, which was that the decision had not been made in real time, but had already been internally finalized before the first sentence was ever spoken. I remember noticing how my perception of the room continued to shift, not physically, but in terms of relevance, as objects and details that once felt familiar now felt detached from their original meaning. The kitchen counter, the lighting, the sound of the house settling around us, all of it remained unchanged, yet none of it aligned with the internal shift that was now fully present. I asked her if Michael Reed understood the full extent of what this meant, and she answered that she did not believe his understanding was relevant to the current stage of her decision, which further reinforced the sense that multiple narratives were now existing independently without needing to intersect. There was no emotional escalation in her tone, only continuity of explanation, as if she was describing a process that had already passed its critical point. I found myself focusing again on smaller details in the environment, not as avoidance, but as a way to maintain cognitive structure while processing the implications of what was being said. Sarah moved slightly toward the hallway, not leaving, but repositioning herself in a way that suggested the conversation no longer required sustained proximity. I asked her one final question, whether she believed there was anything that could still alter her perspective, and she paused for a longer moment than before, then said that at this stage, her perspective was no longer shaped by single events, but by accumulated understanding over time. That answer carried finality in a way that was different from everything else she had said, because it removed the possibility of immediate reversal or correction. I remember standing there without speaking afterward, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was, recognizing that further response would not change the structure that had already been defined. Sarah remained in place for a moment longer, then turned slightly as if preparing to leave the immediate space of the conversation, signaling that from her side, the exchange had already reached completion. I stayed still, processing the realization that while I was still inside the moment, she had already moved beyond it, and that difference in temporal understanding had become the most important part of everything that had unfolded between us. The silence that followed her movement toward the hallway was not an ending, but a transition into a different kind of awareness, where the conversation no longer existed as an active exchange, but as a completed structure. I was still standing inside. I remained in the kitchen, no longer attempting to maintain a sense of position or direction, but instead allowing the reality of what had been said to settle in without resistance. Sarah Carter was still visible in my peripheral view, not speaking, not adding anything further, but no longer fully engaged in the space between us either. It was as if she had already stepped out of the emotional timeline of the moment while I was still processing it in real time. I eventually asked her if she was planning to tell Michael Reed that I now knew, and she paused briefly before responding that she did not believe further disclosure would change anything that was already in motion. That answer carried a different weight than the previous ones, because it implied that multiple outcomes had already been considered and accounted for without my involvement. I remember noticing how my attention kept drifting between her and the physical environment around me, not because I was distracted, but because my mind was attempting to stabilize itself by referencing unchanged objects in the room. The refrigerator hum, the steady lighting, and the stillness of the house all remained consistent, yet none of them aligned with the internal restructuring that was now taking place in my understanding of everything that had been said. Sarah finally shifted her position fully toward the hallway, not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet finality that suggested the conversation no longer required her continued presence. I asked her one last time if she understood what this meant for every shared responsibility we had built together, and she replied that she had already evaluated those aspects and integrated them into her decision long before speaking. That statement reinforced a realization that had been forming throughout the conversation, which was that I had been participating in an unfolding explanation while she had already completed her interpretation of it in advance. There was a moment where neither of us spoke, and in that silence I became aware of how different the experience of time felt between us in that moment, as if we were no longer operating within the same sequence of understanding. I remained standing in the kitchen while she took a few steps toward the hallway, no longer turning back to add clarification or reassurance, only maintaining a calm consistency in her movement away from the space we had been occupying together. I did not attempt to stop her or extend the conversation further, not because I had accepted the situation, but because I recognized that additional dialogue would no longer alter the structure that had already been established. The house around me felt unchanged in its physical form, yet completely altered in its meaning, as if every object and sound now belonged to a version of reality that no longer included the assumptions I had brought into it earlier that evening. I stood there for an extended moment after she had moved out of immediate view, processing not only what had been revealed, but the deeper realization that understanding itself had occurred at different speeds between us, creating a separation that was no longer about events, but about perception of time and conclusion. After Sarah Carter disappeared further down the hallway, the kitchen remained exactly the same in structure, but completely altered in meaning, as if the space itself had stopped acknowledging the version of reality I had been operating under only minutes earlier. I stayed in place for a while without moving, not because I was frozen, but because I was trying to understand the difference between emotional reaction and structural understanding, and how quickly one can replace the other when enough information is introduced at once. The silence in the house was no longer neutral. It felt distributed, extending beyond the kitchen into every adjacent room, creating the sense that the entire environment was now observing itself without participating in anything familiar. I eventually moved toward the counter again, not to return to any earlier state of normality, but to anchor myself in something physical while my mind continued processing the implications of what had been said. Sarah did not return, and there was no indication that she intended to resume the conversation, which reinforced the realization that what had occurred was not an exchange seeking resolution, but a completed transition of perspective on her side. I found myself replaying fragments of her statements, not emotionally, but analytically, attempting to identify the exact point at which her interpretation of our shared reality had diverged from mine. The difficulty was that there was no single moment that could be isolated, only a gradual accumulation of differences that had become visible all at once. I sat down at the edge of a nearby chair, still within the kitchen, and for the first time allowed myself to stop responding internally to each thought as it arrived. That pause revealed something I had not fully acknowledged earlier, which was that I had been treating the conversation as ongoing even after it had already been concluded by her standards. The realization did not come with emotional collapse or visible reaction, but with a quiet recognition that I had been participating in a delayed version of an event she had already moved beyond. I looked around the kitchen again, noticing how unchanged it remained, yet how completely detached it now felt from the context I had associated with it before the conversation began. I considered whether there was any additional question I could ask that might alter the structure of what had been established, but even as the thought formed, I recognized that it would not change the underlying configuration she had already described. There was a moment where I became aware of the absence of urgency in the environment, as if time itself had slowed only for me while everything else had already progressed past this point. I remained seated, no longer expecting her return, but still processing the fact that departure in this case was not physical absence, but completion of intent. I began to understand that what I had interpreted as a conversation was actually a sequence of confirmations for her, each one reinforcing a conclusion that had already been accepted internally before any words were spoken. That distinction reframed everything that had happened in a way that removed the need for emotional interpretation and replaced it with structural clarity. The kitchen light remained steady above me, and the sound of the house continued in its usual quiet rhythm. But neither of those elements connected any more to the version of life I had assumed I was still part of earlier that evening. I stayed there for an extended period, not waiting for anything to continue, but allowing the full realization to settle that the conversation had already ended long before I understood it was over, and that I was now simply occupying the space where it had taken place after its conclusion had already been reached elsewhere. The house felt quieter the longer I stayed in the kitchen, not because the environment had changed, but because my perception of it had shifted into something more detached, as if I was no longer part of the same system that had existed before the conversation began. I remained seated for a while longer, not actively thinking about what to do next, but instead allowing the sequence of events to settle into a structure that my mind could process without resistance. Sarah Carter did not return, and there was no sound indicating that she intended to re-enter the space, which reinforced the understanding that what had occurred between us had already reached its final form from her perspective. I eventually stood up again, moving slowly through the kitchen without direction, not searching for anything specific, but attempting to re-establish a sense of physical awareness that was not tied to interpretation. As I walked, I noticed how ordinary everything still looked, the unchanged arrangement of objects, the consistent lighting, the familiar silence of a home that had not yet caught up to the meaning I now associated with it. I stopped near the edge of the counter again, not because I needed to return there, but because it was the last place where I still had a clear memory of the conversation unfolding in real time. I found myself thinking about the structure of what Sarah had said, not as isolated statements, but as a progression that had steadily moved toward completion without requiring my participation for validation. That realization changed how I viewed the entire interaction, because it suggested that my responses had not shaped the outcome, but had only existed within it. I looked toward the hallway where she had walked earlier, but there was no movement, no indication of return, only the continuation of silence that now felt more like conclusion than absence. I considered whether there was anything unresolved, any detail that had been left open, but the more I reviewed it internally, the more I understood that nothing had been left incomplete from her point of view. The structure of her explanation had already accounted for every relevant component as she saw it, leaving no space for additional negotiation or reinterpretation. I began to recognize that my remaining presence in the kitchen was not part of an ongoing exchange, but a delayed continuation of something that had already ended elsewhere in her understanding. That distinction created a shift in how I experienced time in that moment, as if I was operating slightly behind the point where meaning had already been finalized. I moved again, this time toward the living room entrance, not because I had decided on a direction, but because remaining in the kitchen alone no longer felt necessary for comprehension. The transition between rooms did not change the environment in any noticeable way, but it changed my perspective enough to make me aware of how static everything remained despite the internal restructuring taking place within me. I sat down, briefly on the edge of the sofa, not to rest, but to allow the implications of everything that had been said to stabilize into something that did not require constant reinterpretation. As I sat there, I realized that the conversation was no longer the central event, but rather the point at which I had become aware that different understandings of the same life can reach completion at different times without ever intersecting again in the same way. The final stretch of that night did not arrive with closure in the way I expected it to, but rather with a slow settling of reality into something that no longer required explanation in order to exist. I remained in the living room after moving from the kitchen, sitting still as the house around me maintained its ordinary structure, unchanged in appearance yet completely redefined in meaning. Sarah Carter was no longer visible, and there had been no return, no continuation of dialogue, no additional clarification, only the absence that confirmed the completion of her part in the conversation. I found myself no longer trying to reconstruct what had been said, because reconstruction implied uncertainty, and what I was beginning to understand was not uncertainty, but finality delivered in a form I had not initially recognized. I sat with that realization for a long time, not actively thinking, but allowing the sequence of events to organize itself without interference. The idea that Michael Reed, Sarah, and I had been part of a structure that had already shifted before any words were spoken began to feel less like interpretation and more like confirmation of a pattern I had not been positioned to see earlier. I noticed how the house continued to function as it always had, the quiet hum of appliances, the stable lighting, the stillness of rooms that had not changed physically, yet none of it aligned with the internal shift that had taken place in my understanding of the situation. I eventually stood up and walked toward the hallway again, not because I expected anything different, but because movement itself had become a way to process what remained unresolved only from my perspective. There was no sound from the bedroom, or any other part of the house that suggested return or continuation, and that absence now carried a different weight than it had earlier in the night. I realized that what I had been treating as an ongoing situation was, in structural terms, already complete, and that my continued reflection was occurring after the point of closure rather than during it. That distinction changed the way I interpreted everything that had happened since the first sentence she spoke. I returned briefly to the kitchen, not out of necessity, but because it represented the origin point of the conversation, and standing there again made it clear how static the environment remained compared to the internal transformation I had undergone while inside it. I thought again about the sequence of statements she had made, each one building not toward persuasion, but toward confirmation of a decision already formed independently of my reaction. I began to understand that my role in the exchange had not been to influence outcome, but to receive information that had already been finalized elsewhere. That realization removed the emotional urgency I had been unconsciously carrying and replaced it with a more detached clarity that allowed the events to be seen as structure rather than disruption. I sat down once more, this time without the expectation of continuation, and allowed the silence to remain without trying to fill it with interpretation or resistance. The house remained unchanged, the night remained still, and the absence of further communication confirmed that what had unfolded earlier was not the beginning of a conflict, but the end of a process I had only just become fully aware of in retrospect.